Subcommittee of Water Resources and Environment, Subcommittee T and I will come to order. Today we'd like to welcome everybody. We're going to have two panels, and our hearing today is about abandoned mines and the opportunities for Good Samaritan cleanups. Past mining activities far removed from the sophisticated mining practices we see today disturbed hundreds of thousands of acres of land, altered drainage patterns, and generated substantial amounts of waste scattered around the nation. Today it is estimated there are many as 500,000 of these old mine abandoned sites in the United States. Many of these mines were abandoned by the owners or operators a long time ago, once the remaining minerals became too difficult or costly to extract. Although operated consistent with the laws of the time, but not all of them, of these abandoned mines now pose environmental and health threats to surrounding surface and groundwaters, nearby lands, and downstream communities. It is estimated that tens of thousands of miles of streams across the nation are polluted by acid mine drainage and toxic loading of heavy metals leaching from many of these old mines, impacting fisheries and water supplies. State and federal agencies have worked to remedy these problems, as have local governments and non-governmental organizations, but the number of these sites and the expense involved has made progress very slow. Some of these old mines lack a viable owner or operator with the resources to remediate them. Many others are truly abandoned, with no identifiable owner or operator to hold responsible. As a result, few of these old mine sites are getting cleaned up. Public or private volunteers, or otherwise known as Good Samaritans, are willing to carry out a partial or complete remediation at some of these sites. These Good Samaritans may be driven by a desire to improve the environment. Others may want to improve water quality at their water supply source. Still others may want to clean up an old mine site for the purpose of remining the area. However, most Good Samaritans have been deterred from carrying out these projects by the risk of becoming liable for complete cleanup required by various environmental laws. This is because federal laws do not always allow for partial cleanups. For example, if a Good Samaritan steps up into a partially cleaned up an abandoned mine site, the party could become liable under the Clean Water Act or Superfund for a greater level of cleanup and higher costs than the party initially volunteered for. In the end, most potential Good Samaritans refrain from attempting to address the site's pollution problems at all because they could face the legal consequences if they call up short of a complete cleanup. While Superfund and the Clean Water Act has been successful in reducing pollution for commercial and industrial locations, these laws have also had the unforeseen consequence of deterring cleanup at the abandoned mine sites. In other words, laws that were designed to protect the environment may now be inadvertently harming or discouraging the cleanup of the environment. Our laws should encourage rather than discourage parties to volunteer themselves to clean up abandoned mine sites. We should consider whether in some circumstances environmental standards should be made more flexible in order to achieve at least a partial cleanup of these sites that otherwise will remain polluted. This is not about letting polluters off the hook. Those who pollute will remain legally responsible for pollution they caused. I believe there is little disagreement that encouraging volunteers to clean up abandoned mine sites is a worthwhile policy, since some improvement is better than no improvement. However, in exploring the details of such a policy, a number of issues arise, such as who should be eligible, how should new standards be applied, and how should potential remining of these sites be addressed. To help us identify and address these and other issues, we have a panel of witnesses that have been actively involved in the debate over how to address the abandoned mines problems in this country. I hope our witnesses will bring forward ideas how we can improve the impediments to abandoned mine cleanups and get more Good Samaritans. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. My name is Luke Russell. I'm Vice President of External Affairs with Hecla Mining Company. I've been involved in environmental compliance, reclamation, and remediation of mine sites for over 30 years, including time worked as remediation manager with the state of Idaho at the Coeur d'Alene Basin Superfund site in northern Idaho. Hecla Mining Company is the oldest precious metals mining company in North America and the United States' largest primary silver producer. Today I am testifying on behalf of the National Mining Association, who represents the miners, vendors, and suppliers of America's mining industry. National Mining and its member companies have long been interested in promoting the voluntary cleanup of legacy mines through the development of Good Samaritan legislation. When we speak about abandoned mines, it is important to note that we are talking about sites with no viable owner. that were created due to mining practices of 100 to 150 years ago, well before the enactment of modern environmental laws, regulations, and reclamation requirements. We are not talking about mines of today. Today's operators must provide financial assurance to guarantee their sites will be properly reclaimed, and billions of dollars have been posted with the state and federal governments for exactly this purpose. Thus, the abandoned mine land problem is a finite and historical problem, not one that will grow in the future. Industry wants to see legacy sites reclaimed, safety and environmental conditions improved as much as anyone. After all, they are incorrectly portrayed as being our dirty pictures, when in fact they represent results of historic practices. The mining industry has the desire, the experience, the equipment, and the technology to mitigate and reclaim abandoned mine lands. Any Good Samaritan faces the risk of perpetual liability under provisions of the Clean Water Act and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. For example, under the Clean Water Act, a Good Samaritan that affects a discharge, even if working to improve site conditions, becomes fully responsible in perpetuity, even if they had no role in creating the conditions that originally caused the adverse water quality. Consequently, remediation measures that could result in incremental and in some cases significant water quality improvements are not undertaken for fear of the resulting liability. Furthermore, a Good Samaritan begins to clean up or even just investigates an abandoned mine site runs the risk of becoming an operator under CERCLA. CERCLA liability is joint, several, strict, and retroactive. Such potential liability is chilling to any voluntary cleanup effort. If a goal of Good Samaritan legislation is to improve water quality, the environment, and public safety, then such legislation must encourage cleanups by reducing the legal impediments. To remove the legal barriers discussed previously, regulators should be given discretion to adjust environmental requirements, standards, and liabilities for Good Samaritan projects. Mining companies should be allowed to qualify as Good Samaritans. Mining companies that did not create the identified environmental problems at a legacy site should be allowed to qualify. EPA or states must permit Good Samaritan projects. Projects should be authorized on a site-by-site basis with discretion to allow important environmental improvements that may fall short of addressing all contaminants at site, so long as their net improvement is achieved. Good Samaritan legislation should also allow remedial actions that include the reuse or reprocessing of materials from legacy sites. At some abandoned mine sites, the best way to partially or wholly remediate the environment may be to collect the various materials located at the site, utilize them in construction of a new mining operation, or process those materials to remove any valuable minerals, and then to dispose of those wastes in an environmentally sound manner. Such projects would be subject to appropriate federal or state assessment and approval through a Good Samaritan permit program. Protecting the public interest and ensuring more effective and efficient cleanup of legacy sites created in the distant past is possible and should include Good Samaritan legislation that embodies the elements discussed above. The mining industry stands ready to be a part of this solution. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today.
Mr. Russell, thanks for all of your testimony. It's all great and great helpful, but Mr. Russell, you talk about mining companies need to qualify for Good Samaritan works, okay? And I would agree with that because that's where the expertise is, and I think we had discussion on the first panel about questioning the expertise of that panel. I guess the first question is, what issues are you facing that you haven't been able to qualify? And then also, would remining an abandoned site, is that an issue? Because we're talking about we need more resources. Now, it seems to me one of the ways that maybe get resources is some of these abandoned mines can be reopened when they're reclaimed or maybe areas in the mine can be remined. You're the expert, you have to tell me. But I'll just give you an example, an analogy. I know in the oil gas fields, you know, we've got wells that were put in the 20s and 30s, and now we've seen, until the price dropped anyways, coming back in with the new technology, they can strip those wells out and get oil and gas they couldn't get 50, 60 years ago because of technology. So with improved technology, remining efforts, is this one way to go? And if that is what's the challenges regulatory to be able to get there? As you say, mining companies need to be qualified.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Let me give you an example. I worked at a mine that it was first mined in the late 1860s. The competing mining camps were called Leesburg and Grantsville on the hills of the U.S. Civil War. 100 years later, I was there permitting a new mine, new technology, able to come back into that same area and mine again. The historic mining had left placer sediments in the downstream area. As a part of the modern mine, we were able to come in, clean that material up, use some of that material as part of the construction. So it was a win-win for the environment, a win for us. So we did not reprocess that material, but we were able to utilize it as construction material. So yes, there's great opportunity, and as it's testified earlier, that under a Good Samaritan program, there would be a bright line between what would be that type of remediation and cleanup and what would be a renewed mining operation. That renewed mining operation would be subject to all state and federal permitting. It would be required to post a financial assurance, which would be different than that first piece, which could be remediation.
Now, are you seeing roadblocks put up by the regulatory agencies to do that? What's the challenges been?
Certainly the biggest challenge is, was mentioned earlier, is if there is a discharge, the wheels fall off. The liability, potential liability of having to be responsible for that in perpetuity essentially is a chilling effect.
Yeah, so essentially you're buying the liability that was from 100 years ago.
Exactly right.
And so they call that a tail. You know, it goes on forever.
It's a long tail. Yeah.
Long tail. You talk, so, Ms. Manfatana, do you have any final questions?
Well, I'd like to ask probably of Mr. Russell. What is the process of a mine when it's closed, a hard rock mine when it's closed? What do they do to the mine?
That is obviously a site-specific response, but in general, at the latter stages of the mining process today, mines are designed to be closed. So at the latter stages of the active mining, activities are being taken to recontour and regrade the site to address any residual chemicals, covering materials that could have
How do they do
potential.
that? How do they do that? They put water in it? Do they fill it with water?
Well, if it's an open pit or an underground, some may fill with water at closure. Some are dry closures. It just depends on the geography of the geology of the site.
Okay. And if there is watershed coming through, will that fill up that water? Potential leak problems in the future?
It's, again, site-specific. In many cases, no. In some cases, that is a concern, but that would have been identified in the initial baseline environmental study that would have done exactly what Mr. Young was saying on some of these abandoned sites that can't be done. But for an active or a new mining operation, that is thoroughly investigated prior to the start of mining operations. So we know at the time of closure if that would be an issue that needed to be addressed, and we would try to address it as a part of the active mining operation, not leave it to the final stages of closure.
But in the mines that have not been covered through the mining law, it was prior to the old abandoned, what happens to them? I mean, they're graded. Does somebody go back and reassess them and be able to say these are possibility mines that possibly might be leaking contaminants into the nearby streams or the rivers or the aquifers?
Yeah. You're talking about abandoned lands.
Correct.
At this point. Yeah. So abandoned lands that have been identified and resources brought to bear, such as Trout Unlimited and others through Good Samaritan effort or state programs like in Pennsylvania, they are being addressed by either removal actions, cover actions, et cetera, to address whatever that source of contaminant is to reduce or remove it.
But it depends on the size of the problem too, so that the Good Samaritans would not be able to go in and clean up a major site. So what happens to those mines that are not going to be considered doable for Good Sam to go in and work with?
There may be limits to what a Good Sam would be interested and willing to do, but I think if the goal is improvement in the environment or reduction in risk to human health or public safety, then there is a lot that can be done. A big bang for a small amount of dollars can be achieved by partial remediation at those sites.
Right, but there's still going to be some that are going to fall through the cracks. How do we protect the communities and the environment and all the other things that are impacted with those that are not going to fall into that let's look at them and find out where they're at? or they are on the list, or their potential in these? What about those mines?
Well, those sites, again, by making some measured gains that we have seen through collaborative efforts and through the state programs that Mr. Cavazza has talked about, we are addressing those. But and not all the sites. I mean, if you talk about, you know, heard 500,000 sites, there's just a subset of those that pose any environmental issue whatsoever. Some are a small pit, some might be a shaft, but there are, in that universe, it's only a subset of sites that actually are posing environmental issues, not to undermine those impacts on those sites, but it is not all of those sites.